Good evening. I'm Nancy Eberhardt, and I'm on the Connecticut Reading League board, and have the pleasure and privilege to be welcoming Dr. Sharon Ware this evening. Interestingly, she started out as a financial analyst, and it's our really good fortune that somewhere along the way, she had an experience that inspired her to switch to the field of reading. And she went on to earn a master's in language and literacy from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and then her PhD in special education from the University of Connecticut. Now there are some very lucky teachers in training who get to work with Sharon to learn how to be effective instructors in reading, writing, and spelling. And so this evening, she's going to grace our event by talking about speech to print, what's the buzz? And without further ado, let me turn that over to Sharon. Welcome.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I am going to share my screen. Let me see. Let me see if I can share. Here we go. And 1 second. Right. There we go. Well, hello, everyone, and I'm really excited to see you all and to talk about what is really my favorite topic, which is reading, and particularly speech to print instruction in reading. So what we're going to cover today in the time we have is I'd like to explain how speech to print instruction is different from print to speech being another important approach, but speech to print being having some unique features. So I'd like to tell you what the instruction looks like, discuss some of the key instructional features, talk about how this can make a difference for beginning and struggling readers, and most importantly, how teachers can infuse this approach within a program that teaches print to speech, because these really are, speech to print is encoding to teach reading, and print to speech is decoding to teach reading. So why the buzz? I'm really excited about it as someone who discovered speech to print instruction 25 years ago, to finally hear people actually talking about it. This graphic kind of gives us an idea of where we've been and where we are. This graphic was created by Marnie Ginsberg of who founded Reading Simplified. She and I started pretty much the same way in the late 1990s, struggling to teach a child to read and finding the book, Why Our Children Can't Read and What We Can Do About It. And you can see that's really way back at the beginning. I was very fortunate, as was Marnie, to get trained in phonographics. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my parents who made that possible by taking care of our son while I went to get that training. Because when I write in here it was life-changing, it truly was life-changing to find a method that worked with the child I needed to teach and has worked with many children since. So Diane McGinnis called her approach linguistic phonics, gets called linguistic phonics, speech to print. And there are lots and lots of programs that have come out of this. I'm familiar with SpellLinks, Spellphabet, Reading Simplified is fabulous. Many of these great resources to check into. So what makes speech to print different? The biggest thing is that instruction begins with the sounds that children are speaking rather than that letters have sounds. It recognizes the direction of the code is from spoken words to written symbols. So for the child, the focus is on hearing words, isolating the sounds in words, right? And helping children actively notice how the graphemes or the spellings of the sounds, right, are representing the sounds they speak for reading, for spelling, and for writing. So students are taught through experience how the code works. And when I say through experience, I'm not saying that there isn't explicit instruction, because indeed there is, but it is embedded from sound to written word and using words so that it is very much situated in reading. There aren't rules taught, but there are patterns that children learn through exposure. So we know that teaching explicit systematic phonics is important. And some of the important things we know from research: the brain evolved for spoken language, right? Babies and young children learn the sounds of the language they're hearing as they develop. And an important thing about that is to understand that the baby's brain organizes around the sounds of language, of their spoken language. So babies actually are sensitive to phonemes. They aren't consciously, and certainly by the time they are using language, they're not thinking of individual sounds, but that is how the brain organizes. Written language, on the other hand, is a human invention, and the brain has to reorganize and create a reading system to process this incoming visual information and connect it to the sound system. The best explanation I ever heard about this was by Stanislas Dehaene. I have a link to his video here. I highly recommend that you spend 15 minutes watching him. He's fun to listen to in his French accent, but he really tells us from a neuroscience point of view what is happening when the brain learns to read. So the sound system of the brain exists, and it's organized around phonology, the sounds of language. When we're introduced to letters for the purpose of reading, a portion of the visual cortex gets reorganized to interpret those letters. And then this connection must be made between the letters and the sounds. So you see here a yellow band of activity. And if you watch the video, this is all in wild motion. And you'll see this connection, important connection being made, and a new connection. As he said, our anatomical connections change when we learn to read. This is another way, another graphic I use to explain and to explain instruction to my students. And that is, this is Adam's model of skilled reading, where we see at the bottom the orthographic processor that needs to connect to the phonological processor. So the orthographic processor is the input of print and processing of print. The phonological processor, the processor of sounds, and going to the semantic processor in the context of what we're reading, right, or hearing. And that route shown through in blue is connecting the orthographic to the phonologic to the semantic, and the context creates a process called orthographic mapping. And that bonds the word or the spellings into our brain. We also know from Dehaene that once that bond is secure, there is a more direct route going directly from the visual input to the meaning. And something I do with my students a lot is I will just flash the word rain in front of them, and I'll say, don't read that. And of course, you can't inhibit reading. When your eye hits a word, you read it. But we talk about, did you decode it? No. Right? Did you think about the letters? No. What did you think about? You thought about the rain yesterday. You thought about, do I have my umbrella? But it went from that word to an idea. And we want to teach in a way that creates that automatic word reading for our students. And if we do a good job of connecting the orthographic processing with the phonological processing, with the semantic processing, and the context processor, we're going to have the best chance of that child developing lots of automatic word reading. So what makes it different, right? Well, because it begins with sounds, right? And we're not teaching that it's letters. So we all agree phonemic awareness is necessary for reading, that speech sounds are meaningless in isolation. If I walked up to you and said, ah, it would mean nothing, right? And phoneme level skills are most effectively taught with letters. We've known that for a long time from the National Reading Panel in 2000, but lots of phonemic awareness work is done without letters. And including letters actually is more effective, and teaching both ways is appropriate. So teaching letter sounds. Here's an illustration of a difference. In print to speech, it would lead with letter names, right? Holding up a large card with the letter T. This is the letter T. This picture is a top. This picture will help you remember that the letter makes a special sound. T, top, T. Right? In speech to print, right, we are going to teach letter names, but many approaches don't teach letter names initially. They teach children the sounds of the letters. So leading with sounds and learning that a letter represents the sound. For example, the word cat is taught as k, a, t. This is k. So we often refer to the letters by their sounds. We don't fail to teach letter names, but the sound is really more important. Some good reading about teaching letter names and the importance of teaching letter names and the benefit of letter names for learning the sounds. Tim Shanahan has some great pieces about that. There's one on his website. Phonemic awareness teaching, some differences, right? There's a very popular program that teaches phonemic awareness in isolation. This is an example of a primary level lesson with some really strong features for helping kids identify the sounds, placing palms together and creating chopping, right? And sliding to say the whole word. That chopping motion helps kids count the number of sounds, and that is effective. In speech to print, we're much more likely to do this with letter tiles and say, listen to this word, at. The first sound I hear in at is a. The next sound I hear in at is t. The word is at. Okay. So phoneme manipulation is also another important area of difference where we rarely teach this skill in isolation. It's taught often with in all kinds of lessons throughout speech to print because I'm going to wait to do that because it is a very effective approach for causing kids to listen to what's happening in a word, to be looking at the letters in a word and understanding where they're hearing the sound and how that letter is representing the sound. So it would look something like this, right? This word is cat. What can we change to make it spell mat? Change and put in the So phoneme manipulation, one of the most powerful activities for students to really reinforce the alphabetic principle. And this has a star. It is there to remind you and let you know that this is one of the activities that you can do with students, regardless of what approach you're using. Right, with letter tiles and word chain, you can just say change mat to map. Now change mat to fat, right? And move those around. You can move the middle sound, the ending sound, right? And this is focusing kids' attention on where am I hearing that sound change. So one of the things that's really important in this instruction is your finger, right? And so if you're at the board, you're using your finger on the board to trace the word and say the sounds as you move across the word, right? And very important in this to help kids locate where am I hearing that change in sound. So what does instruction, code-based instruction, look like in speech to print? So teaching the code and the skills needed to read are integrated. The code is how the sounds we speak are written. The skills are phonemic. We need to be able to blend phonemes, segment phonemes, and manipulate phonemes, right? And these skills are also taught in print to speech approaches. We use a word building to teach, in this case, the basic code. So basic code is the consonant sounds, the common sounds for the consonants, and the 5 vowel letters. They're what we call their short sounds, a, I, and And we would say something like, we're going to build some words. The first word we'll build is sat. What's the first sound you hear in sat? If the child says s, good. This is s. Using my finger. What's the next sound you hear in sat? Ah. This is ah. What's the next sound you hear in sat? Right. Sat. The word is sat. When I teach the students at St. Joe's, I give them mentor lessons to help them understand this approach. And I'm going to walk you through one for basic code and one for advanced code to show you what these look like and what the instruction looks like. So it starts, today we're going to practice reading and spelling words with 3 sounds. At the end of this lesson, you'll be able to correctly read at least 5 words that we've practiced all by yourself. So in this lesson, they start with a phonemic awareness warm-up. This particular practice is not done with letter tiles. It is just done orally. And first, I would, particularly with struggling readers, I would model, right? So I'm going to practice blending some sounds. The sounds are st, are. The word is star. What word do I mean when I say st, are? And I may model a couple of times depending on what my students need. And then it's their turn. And this is where teachers get to really modify, right? And offer opportunities to different students at different levels in their class or in the group. So you can give 2 sounds to blend for one student, 4 sounds to another student, and most of them will be doing 3. So this is a good place for differentiation and practice with just hearing the sounds and blending them. Some of the important features of speech to print instruction is the kind of corrective feedback you give. So here, if a student blends incorrectly by getting one sound incorrect, you would repeat it and emphasize the sound that they struggled with. right? If they completely misunderstand the task, you would model again. Then we move on to word building. In word building, we use Elkonin boxes or sound boxes. There's an example on the right, on the side. So they will have a box for each sound in the word they're going to build. We also have a whiteboard marker and a set of letter cards, so the letter tiles, to make this list of words. Your list of words is designed to give the practice you want your students to have. So in this case, right, we see a lot of the and the I sound. We see B's and D's, which kids reverse. So perhaps there's giving some practice with choosing the B and the D when they're building their words. First, I would model. We're going to spell some words with 3 sounds, right? So I'd give the Elkonin box and I'd lay out the letters for bug in random order. Run my finger across the 3 boxes and say bug. The first sound I hear is B. This is B. The next sound I hear is This is The next sound I hear is G. This is G, right? B, G. The word is bug. Now I'd like all the students to write the word on their whiteboard. And I want them to say each sound as they write it. And this is an important feature, right? We're going to form that letter, say the sound that is associated with that letter, and so we're going to form it with our hand, we're going to hear it, we're going to say it. Okay, so now it's the student's turn. And again, we can differentiate with groups, but we guide our student through this. Corrective feedback here is also really important. If a student says they're building map and they say app, right? We'd say app is 2 sounds. What's the first sound in app? Okay. If they say the letter name, right? That's the letter name. That's great. What sound do you hear? Right? Because we want them focused on what they hear connected to what they see happening in that word. So these are really, the error corrections can be the most important and powerful tools because of that focus on sound, what you see, how is it spelled. And this transfers to kids when if they're looking at a word, say reading a book, right, with a teacher or with a parent, and they hear a word read and their eyes are, and if they're used to tracking spellings while they're hearing sounds, they will begin self-teaching, right? They will begin to teach themselves how this code works. After doing a number of word building practices, which is really where the teaching is happening, right? We practice reading the same words that we built, right? So I would give a model and showing them how I'm going to sound out the word just the way we built it, right? And then we'll try one together. And then I would have students read them independently. Again, if student doesn't know one of the sounds, I'm just going to point at the sound, right? And say, this is a, or this is a, right? And then have her blend it, right? If she says all the correct sounds, but blends it incorrectly, try to show her where the error is. If she says sit, right? Say, oh, this is a. This is a. Let's try that again. We also help our students pronounce their sounds clearly. It's really hard to get a word like I tell my students, you never have pet a k-ata, right? You have to get that out of there to as much as you can. So some of our sounds, it's really hard to do that, but with a sound like p, we can get it out. With a sound like b, we have to work at it. But the clearer those sounds are, the easier it is to blend those sounds into a word.
Sharon, before you go on, could we ask you a couple questions that have come up in the chat just to
Absolutely.
The first one is does speech to print have a resource or recommendation in regards to the order to teach the 26 letter sounds?
That is a good question. I think each program is designed in its own way. I can speak for phonographics that it starts with a and ah, and a series of the consonant sounds that make words. So I think really the best advice with this is to start immediately with at least one vowel sound, maybe two, and get enough consonants in that students can build enough real words that they see how this code is going to work. Right?
Okay, that's helpful. And I think the second question you may want to talk about later, but I'll mention it now. Is there any research yet to support the efficacy of students saying sounds as they write? It seems that it should strengthen the connections between speech and print, but it would be nice to have evidence to support this.
Yes, so there is some evidence to support this, and if you follow the Spell Talk blog, it's actually been talked about a lot in recent days. So I don't have that research on the top of my head, but I do know where to find it. And the Spell Talk listserv has that.
Okay, great advice. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So an important thing that, as I mentioned, that we keep in just about every speech to print lesson is doing phoneme manipulation. So this is an example of phoneme manipulation, what you'll see activity. So what you'll see is there are two vowel sounds there. There's the and the I, and a handful of consonants. So not all the letter tiles are there. There's a limited to what you need for your word chain. The teacher has the word chain. The teacher models, right, and builds the first word. So I'm going to build the word rug, and I'll pull down the g, rug. And then again, my finger will say, if this is rug, what can you change to make it spell bug, right? This is rug, change it to spell bug. Okay. I model how to do that, and then the student gets opportunities to do that. Okay. So with the student, right, if they choose the wrong letter, we're going to tell them what they spelled, right? That spells mott, and running your finger along to indicate the sounds, right? We want pot. Where you're most likely to see this is when you're working with words with consonant blends, because a lot of kids struggle to get that second sound in. And so they will either leave it out, or they will have a 3-sound word and they'll leave it in, right? And so we try to read what they have so they can see where their error is and self-correct. This, again, I'll state it again, one of the really powerful activities that you can do with all kids, because it really, and I do this with like much older struggling readers, and I try to use more complicated words, but doing this activity really helps them understand that letters are representing sounds, and that if we change those letters, the sounds change. A wrap-up assessment, and this, of course, wouldn't happen in the first lesson. A lesson would be lots of word building opportunities and reading opportunities and phoneme manipulation opportunities. But ultimately, we would see, can our kids now read this in connected text? And here, with this, I would try to create sentences that don't have irregular words. If they have irregular words, I might do the reading of those words for the student and hold them accountable for what I have taught them how to decode. So what makes word building so powerful, right? Well, it's beginning with the sounds that children are speaking. We're not teaching that letters have sounds. We're teaching that sounds are represented by the letters. The error correction and feedback is focused on sounds that are shown with the letters. For example, if a child reads clap as cap, right? I would say if this was cap, there wouldn't be an l here. Let's try again to read all of the sounds. That's an important distinction. I don't say there wouldn't be an L here. I would say there wouldn't be an L here. They've got an extra sound in the word, right? That they left out. So I know word building is used in a lot of programs. I think the difference here is the focus is on the sounds and not naming the letters that are missing. I've seen word building happen with, this is cap, now make it spell, now add an L and make it spell clap. Right. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the scope and sequence of speech to print instruction. We know the skills that are needed to read: phoneme blending, phoneme segmenting, and phoneme manipulation. And students need to learn the code, right? So we teach these skills with letter tiles and with mapping activities, and I'll explain that more, but mapping is when you're writing a sound and saying it at the same time. So if you're writing rain, you write r, a, n. Okay. We also teach the nature of the code. So this is different than just teaching all the code pieces, right? We want our students to conceptually understand what's happening. So sounds are represented by letters, right? And every systematic, explicit phonics lesson teaches this, right? Some sounds are spelled with more than one letter. We teach this too, right? Everybody teaches that. But there's more than one way to spell some of our sounds. This is really taught explicitly, and how to manage this is taught explicitly. And the fourth point there, that some spellings represent more than one sound, I call that overlap. It is important to acknowledge that to readers and to give them a way to manage that. And I'm going to show you some of that. Okay. Oops, I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. Okay, so to teach that sounds are represented by letters, we teach the basic code, right? We looked at a basic code lesson that is one-to-one correspondence. We teach the skills of blending, segmenting, and manipulating in those lessons, embedded in those lessons. So the code is taught through word building and practiced through reading, right? So we teach through encoding and practice through decoding. And this is used with CVC words, with words with ending blends, with ends with, or words with beginning blends. We then teach that some sounds are spelled with more than one letter. And we don't teach kids to declaratively say some sounds are spelled with more than one letter. We simply teach them the sound sh. You know the sound sh that we hear in ship and wish? I'm going to show you how we spell that. So this teaches the one to more than one correspondence. We're still teaching blending, segmenting, and manipulating in the activities in our lessons. And again, we teach through word building and practice through reading. This is where we get to what's more difficult and what gets really complicated in teaching phonics for most teachers, right? This is where I really struggled and where the research of Diane McGinnis helped me so much, and the phonographics program helped me so much, because all of a sudden we've got like this explosion of vowel sounds and ways to spell them. And how do we make order of this, right? So in this, we're teaching, right, from the sound to the spelling. They're spelled the long vowel sounds, for example, like the sound O, right? It's spelled with vowel plus E. It's spelled with a vowel team like OA and OE. It's spelled with OW. It's spelled just with O, right? So there's multiple ways to spell a sound. We're still blending and segmenting. I'm still throwing manipulation lessons in there, right? And this is taught through reading and mapping. So showing students words with these spellings, helping them read them and write them sorted by their spelling, and to the question before, saying the sounds as they write them.
And Sharon, can you just really reinforce that? Because someone's asking in the chat, I have my students say the letter name when writing the words. Should I be having them say the sound instead?
I think that would be the best approach, because if they say, because when we look at a letter, right, what we need to know about that letter is the sound, right? We don't pet the CAT, right? We pet the cat. And, with older struggling readers, and I always say, if they can learn one thing about the letter, what do you want them to know? The name or the sound? You want them to know the sound. That's what's going to get us to reading. That's what the connection is in the brain, right? From the symbol to the sound. So.
All right, thank you. And one point of clarification, someone D. Ross has asked, is it the Colin Brander et al. Article Teaching Children to Read Irregular Words, a comparison of 3 instructional methods from the scientific studies of reading? Is that the article you were referring to?
I did just get that article. It did occur in that it was one of the things shared, and one of their approaches was saying the sounds. Okay. So that is one of the pieces of research that would probably support that.
Okay, thank you very much.
The last piece of the nature of the code is that some spellings represent more than one sound, right? And again, we're working through the same way through reading and mapping, but I gave you an example here of what this looks like. Plow the snow. There's no one who can create for me a rule that is going to explain why in plow it's ow and why in snow it's o. Right? They're both after blends. They're both 4-letter words. They're both at the end of the word. They're just different words, right? And we've got to acknowledge that and help kids really deal with that. I'm going to show you in a bit how I do it. So, some important notes: we don't teach all the spellings for all the sounds, right? what happens is self-teaching kicks in for many readers, right? They begin to recognize how sounds are spelled without being explicitly taught. Um, Multiple spellings for consonants can be taught incidentally while we're teaching vowel spelling correspondences. So while I'm working with words to teach the O sound or the ow sound or the oi sound, right, I'm going to have some spellings of consonants where it's a double consonant, or it's the MB at the end of a word, like crumb, right? And so you can teach that incidentally as you're teaching the vowel sounds, which are really kind of harder to master. So we teach the basic code 1-to-1. We teach the digraphs, we teach vowel spellings, and we teach multisyllabic reading. Phonographics teaches from CVC words to words with blends. Many programs go from CVC words to consonant digraphs to blends. The reason being that blending adjacent consonants is really difficult, right? And it's a difficult skill for kids to master. So we can teach them more information. If you teach ship, you're still blending 3 sounds. You're adding some new code information. Both are very valid ways to go. With one, you're having to really teach the skill of blending and focus on that. If you're teaching digraphs, what you're doing is you're teaching new code. So either way can be followed. So this is an example of teaching the advanced code, and this one focuses on learning the spellings for the sound A. Right? We don't always use keywords. Phonographics doesn't use keywords and cards like this. I did create these for the mentor lessons for my students. So they would introduce, right, ways to spell the A sound, AI in nail, AY in play, A in table, right? And there are many more spellings of A, right? It depends on the level of your child, how many you teach. You are not going to teach a first grader 6 spellings of A, 3 or 4. Okay. You'll see on my next slide, actually the one after this. I often teach EIGH as a spelling of A because it is common for them to see in the word for the number 8. Right? And understanding that the number 8 word has 2 sounds and 5 letters is kind of fun for kids to recognize. So we would give a student a sheet with columns, and it could have many columns depending on what you're doing. In this, they'd have 3. You can preload them with the spellings. You can have students add the spellings as they discover them in words. You can have them write them after you introduce keywords if you use that. There are a lot of approaches to starting this, right? Where you say, I'm going to give you words to read that have all these spellings of the sound A. Each of you will have a turn. I want you to read the word, then everyone will write the word in the column under the A spelling in the word. In these lessons, when you write the word, I want you to say each sound in the word. Watch, I'll do one to show you what I mean. And I would model it, right? So key features, the student is saying the sounds as she writes, right? Engaging the student in the orthography, how A is spelled, right? You're saying the sound while you're looking at the spellings. The words all have meanings. We don't ever work with nonsense words, right? So the motor movement of the hand and the voice are all involved. And when people talk about multisensory instruction, this is kind of where my head goes, because I think of multisensory meaning all the senses that are involved in reading, spelling, and writing.
Sharon, before you move on, two more
Yep.
questions. One of
Yes.
them, when you're teaching multiple spellings for the same sound, would you have the students say the letters making up that spelling as they say A? Would they say A-I? Or is it?
No,
No, okay,
no, they would write AI and say A.
okay,
So as they wrote across that column, it would be A, A.
okay. And then the second question is that I think is related here is if this approach is used in tier 1 or tier 2, are spelling assessments administered at any level, or is the focus reading and spelling is secondary?
These lessons really teach from an encoding approach, and often we practice spelling, particularly when there are multiple spellings of a sound. We want students to really start to understand which words have which spelling. And this is where they discover patterns, right? You can discover the pattern that AI is usually in the middle of a word, AY is at the end of a word, A alone is often in a multi-syllable word. So yes, spelling is integrated and spelling is assessed. So can you read the word? Can you spell the word?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you would create word cards with those, or have word cards. And if the student reads incorrectly, you point to the spelling of A and ask what sound. Again, if they say a letter name, say, I want to hear the sound. So if I was working with a student and they said RAIN, I would say, good, those are the letter names. Say the sounds as you write it. Trace over that and say the sounds. A, n. Right. We would print on sentence strips and or create sentences for kids to read to practice. So we would move always from individually mapping the words, right? We would practice spelling. And I don't have an example on here, but one way that I do this is I have 3 blocks with the 3 spelling alternatives and lines down the side, and I dictate a word and the student looks at those spellings and chooses, right? And if they want to try 2 different alternatives, I let them do that. And then we say, which one looks right, and circle the right one, right? And that's when we may talk about the patterns. This link, when you receive the slides, you should be able to click on this link. Phonic Books, which comes out of the UK, produces materials for American spelling. Their decodable books are phenomenal. They're beautiful stories, beautiful colors, lots of diversity of all kinds embedded in these books. And this link will take you to free resources. There is a summer camp that's free. There are teaching materials that are free. There is a decodable book series of short books that cover all the spelling patterns that is free to download. Now this is where I show you how to teach overlap. Okay, so I'm going to teach this using the sound O. So we would review ways to spell the O sound: OA, OW, O consonant E. Then review ways to spell the OW sound: OU and OW. Call attention: OW spells ow, it spells O, right? So I'd write the word brown on the board and have students pronounce it with an O and an ow. Which one makes a real word? right? It isn't that OW can spell anything, right? It's not that confusing. It's that OW is either O or OW, and we got to figure out which it is in this word, right? So with a word like town, you pronounce it both ways, and they're both words, tone and town, but we explain that context helps us know which sound to use. So really practice and just hit this head on, right? Clarifying this overlap really is something we have to acknowledge with everybody who has to learn the English reading and spelling code. So have fun with it, right? I love to tell kids to please put my steak on bread and say, okay, underline the EA in there. What sound, what sound, what sound? Why? Right? And we have a good laugh and we say, well, we're not going to say, please put my steak on braid, right? We know how to do this. And it just takes experience with the code. And the same thing with, we have a lot of homonyms and homophones, right? I mean, which bat is it? It's the one that works in the context, right? But with words like sail and sail, how to spell these. So some of the best advice is to really teach them separately, right? So teach one and wait a while before you teach the other so that one of them gets really nicely orthographically mapped before you say, oh, here's a little complication here. Let's work on this one. Another is, if you're really clever, you can create some mnemonics to help kids remember the spellings here. The only one that I could think of was that the bear animal, B-A-E-A-R, bears have ears, and there's an ear in that word, E-A-R. That's the best I could do. We also have to teach multi-syllable word reading, right? We have to maintain our focus on sounds. Syllables are really just a mouthful of sounds, right? We blend so many before we have to stop. We have to stop because there's a sound we have to make that's like a plosive sound, and we can't go from this one to this one, or so there's a natural place to stop. So speech to print doesn't teach syllable types. Why not? Well, let's take a look at them, right? We've taught CVC words. We've taught overlap of vowel spellings, this whole middle thing of silent E and R controlled and vowel teams. Those are all spellings of the vowel sounds that we have taught them about through teaching about variation and overlap, right? How about final stable syllable? Well, let's look at consonant LE syllables. Here's an example of a print to speech approach from a phonics program versus a speech to print. So how in speech to print would you teach how to read simple and table, right? Well, we would not label the consonant, the syllable type as a consonant LE syllable and cross out the E because it doesn't have a sound, because we've already taught students that LE is a spelling of the ul sound, right? We use it a lot at the end of words, right? And they know the sound spelling correspondences for s, I, p, and ul. So what we have to teach them is to recognize vowels in the words and know that that means there are a couple of chunks in the word, right? And we teach them to read around the vowels, to flex the sounds for overlap, and to flex the stress, right? So if you sound out mother, you've got to get to mother, right? You've got to flex your sounds and flex your stress to make it a real word. So it keeps it really focused on the sounds and the simplicity of it. Another example, in the print to speech, we see at the end this exception to STLE. And it caused me to think, okay, how would I teach STLE? Well, this is how you do it in a speech to print approach, right? I'd say, this word is whistle, and I'd show you the word whistle. How many chunks do you hear or syllables do you hear in whistle? Whistle or whistle, right? And it's going to depend on what your student hears, right? So write them. They know they've got to keep that T, right? You can't lose a letter. You didn't hear it, but you can't lose it. So where does it go, right? So we discuss the spelling. We talk about ways to remember the spelling of this word, like whistle. We say whistle, but we spell whistle, right? We have to figure out, we have to be able to spell it. So we'd read lots of other words with the same spelling pattern. Hustle, nestle, wrestle, right? Then we talk about other words where ST, right, spelling spells S, like in listen and glisten and fasten, right? And we'd find other examples of it so that when we see it, it doesn't throw us off. And when we have to spell it, we remember.
Sharon, again, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a couple relevant questions while you're here.
Sure.
One of them is people are reconciling training that they've had. Letters talks about syllables, teaching them. So this individual's asking at what age would you teach this, or that there's a difference between the approaches?
I think there is a difference between the approaches, that this approach really doesn't. And a lot of research coming out, you can look at Devin Kern's research, really talks about how important it is to know syllable types. I would venture that many of us of a certain age never heard of syllable types. And yet we all learn to read and spell. Syllable types, I think Louisa Moats says that syllable types helps us with spellings. But I'm not really sure how to reconcile that, except that the research is really showing us that there are simpler ways to attack multi-syllable words, and I would refer to the research of Devin Kern's in particular.
Right, and there's an article within the last couple of cycles with the Reading League Journal on that Devin did take on that topic for those that might want to track that down. Then another question is how to teach students to flex the stress. How can you talk about how you actually teach that?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, so I teach it playfully by using words where I put the stress in the wrong place, because kids don't really have a clue what you're talking about. And I actually use a phrase that that my dad used to use jokingly, which is put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So it really is practice. So for example, with whistle, right? Is it whistle or whistle? And getting kids to hear that difference and practice that difference.
Right. Well, I know that part of that, I think, related information is having that word in your listening vocabulary helps you to make some of that flexing. I don't want you to not get through your presentation, but the questions are so relevant that I wanted to take time.
All right. Shall I finish up? Okay. Okay. So I just want to address a couple of other things, prefixes and suffixes, right? They are speech parts that add a really important layer of meaning to words. And we can focus on both the sound and the meaning of those word parts, just like we stay grounded in the meaning of words as we're learning through the speech to print approach, right? So quick example, dis is d-is, right? It's dis, easy to decode. The meaning, it means not or opposite of. And it's an opportunity to say, okay, what about dislike, right? Does not like. Okay, distrust, does not trust. Disagree, does not agree. Disinfect gets a little harder to just, but no infection, make it go away, right? It somehow goes away. Distaste and disgrace, lots of opportunity to discuss those words, the meaning. How do we get to what disgrace means? How does that prefix help us understand the meaning of the word, even if it isn't as straightforward as dislike? And that really brings me to the end. I wanted to read a quote from the foreword to Why Our Children Can't Read by Steven Pinker. Children are wired for sound, but print is an optional accessory that must be painstakingly bolted on. This is a basic fact about human nature that should be the starting point for any discussion of how to teach our children to read and write. We need to understand how this contraption called writing works, how the mind of the child works, and how to get the two to mesh. And I think that Diane McGinnis did an amazing job when she pulled this all together in a linguistic phonics approach back in 1997, and I'm certainly grateful to her and to all of the McGinnises for creating phonographics and for spawning so many other wonderful approaches that follow this tradition of linguistic phonics. So the slides have an area of resources, links to Reading Simplified, where they're fabulous. Marnie is very generous with free samples, great webinars, teaching examples. The Phonographics Reading Program has great things, phonics books. Ebley has webinars. Sortagories, digging more into words and their meanings. And the more you know about a word, the easier it is to read. Right? And then please do yourself a favor and watch Stanislas Dehaene on the reading brain. And that's it. Do we have more questions?
Well, the question is, will the slides be shared? We will be sending out a PDF of the slides. They're not, they'll be readable in the same way that you're seeing them here, a printable form for you.
Okay.
Are there any other questions before we let Sharon go and exhale at the end of a long day? Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm just looking to see if there's a question. Will you be, yes, if you, when you get the PDF, you will be able to click on the links within the PDF. And I tried that today myself. So it'll be electronic file. So you will be able to click to get to these things.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for joining.
Well, Maura, thank you for taking your time to give us all this information and make the distinction between speech to print and print to speech. I learned a lot and appreciate your knowledge on this topic. So on behalf of everyone, thank you. And anyone who attended tonight will be getting a link with the recording and the printable PowerPoint. So,
and thank you to the Connecticut Reading League for giving me the opportunity.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Should we stop the recording?